In the following presentation, I'm to evaluate certain key components of the notion of essence and actuality, and how they are coordinates to our particularity, and how they might also be aspects of something more universal or more concerned with the idea that subjectivity as such is natured by actuality and essence, and objectivity is essentially natured by its sense of the notion of universality. And where it concerns the notion of universality, we have this overarching consideration that things are presumably natural to the administered state of things, such as we have in the country of Canada, which is things such as universal health care, that everyone is considered in the same way and in the same fashion and by the same means of access to universal health care, things of this sort. In this country, for instance, this idea that having universal health care is a function of universality is possibly qualitatively incorrect, that it is a function of universality insofar as subjects and as actual essential subjects, we are particular beings. We are particular beings in the sense that everyone makes choices under their own terms and makes decisions about the process whereby they will approach this human experience in a rational way or in an irrational way, and how that arrives at whether or not we can justly say that if someone is being irrational, they are perhaps proposing the possibility that suddenly some sort of dilemma would occur to them that would question the sobriety of their human reality, why they were doing something, why they were engaged in something. All Western democracies have the idea of a backup plan for subjects that are not able to take care of themselves, and that is part of the idea of sort of the confluence of the polarity between an essentialism, an actuality, and an existentialism or a universality, which is the notion that of existentialism, that existentialism as a universality would be the idea that everyone has the freedom to choose what they want to do with themselves, and it's an open sort of system of actualizing one's own purpose and proceeding to go through the various steps in order to make that a reality for someone. Whereas the notion that there would be something very particular to the person, essentially stems from Kant's idea of agent and patient. So the universality of it in the healthcare system, such as Canada has and other countries, whereby we are provided with the ability to be taken care of by the government ultimately for our health considerations and our concerns and so on and so forth, equally is part of Kant's idea of the agent. If you've read Critique of Pure Reason, whereas the patient is the particular person that has made their rational choices or their mistakes. Given the situation, it comes down to the notion of cause and effect. The cause is sometimes presupposed by the system itself, So the idea that universal healthcare would be put in place already would suggest that the cause was in place for someone to potentially, under the auspices of the notion of universality, make a mistake and make a poor choice, and that would be the reason why something would happen to that person. So in that sense, it's already installed sort of in the mass tent of universality that universal healthcare would determine the idea that someone was going to make a mistake. Where it concerns the notion of universal healthcare being identifiable as universality, that's the notion of the agent or cause in the Kantian system. Now, the idea of patient being a particularity, being the particular individual that is assigned the notion that they must take responsibility for their actions and they must coordinate their own affairs bioeconomically, biopolitically, socioeconomically, sociopolitically, and the biogenesis and the ontogenesis of what drives their own sense of self-worth, their own value, and their own centering as a human being would be how they identify with this notion of universality and how they describe their changes whereby the causes are presupposed by the idea of universality, making it part of an experience of a nation state such as this is, or other nation states, and that this would sort of be a model for organizing society in a way that we could actually begin to presuppose our own identities as such, as subjects. We would presuppose those identities. We would suddenly become identical to ourselves. Our being would be reflexive of this notion of cause and effect, but it would also be accommodated by the idea of universal healthcare or universalism, from the standpoint that the particular subject and the particularism itself, in itself, was part of what drove the bioeconomic, biopolitical concerns of universality, universalism, universal healthcare, etc. And that the natural process of self-realization would become about subjectivity resolving to those notions that it was contained within itself as a subject and its own process of identifying its considerations and its concerns with the notion of cause and effect. I mean, the presupposition would be the notion of universality imposed upon the subject in terms of the aforementioned. Subjectivity would there too find its way toward identifying something that required rationalism, required the notion that how we approach things rationally, even in terms of our noumenal self-identity, the idea of projecting identity upon the other, is something that is concerned with its notions as something rational, effectively, as an effect of what has already been presupposed by the nation state, which contains the properties of the biopolitical, bioeconomic, sociopolitical, socioeconomic system. And within that, the orders by which we would become, we wouldn't simply become effects to a cause, we would rather be sort of concerned with something that had already been installed in terms of the fact that it is rational, yet dialectical. it is dialectically rational, and that the claims being made are effectual in that they are not simply presuppositions, but they are a priori notions that have accommodated what has been installed as ideas presupposed by the state, for instance, and that those would be the liaison to the idea that human relations, economic relations, social relations, political relations, symbolic relations would all accommodate these ideas in such a way that they would be formed by their own instantiation as a veridical appropriation of what had been initiated by the presupposed notion that universalism or universality or an overarching hierarchical structure was determining the ideas that natured someone in their own subjectivity. Is ultimately that would be the purpose. If there's to be any purpose for hierarchical structures, that would be to nature someone in their own subjectivity. But I think that's the notion of raising someone into sort of more of a horizontal plane of consciousness. So the idea that you could actually naturally engage something that was presupposed of its essential qualities and its actuality would be the determining factor to how the agent, patient, or structural composition of cause and effect was being sort of given its authentic sort of unified substance that was more related to interpersonal engagement and ideas that were formed by not something presupposed by its instantiation, but something that was instantiated by what was presupposed by subjectivity as it conferred with the notion of its own social engagement. So it's a naturalization of the human experience as form and matter in essence, but actuality being intrinsic to the human experience, whereby it is not simply sort of part of the simple sort of duality of property and subject. So the dualism there is essentially, I have the notion here of what I call a monistic duality, a monistic dualism. And it's sort of I'm bridging a gap of a terrain that is simply between two worlds in essence, pardon me. But the idea of a monistic dualism is the idea that essentialism is not necessarily wrong, that the object can still posit itself as such, but that some sort of moral or ethical unification with substance may occur, whereby the object is identifiable as something that is different than the subject in terms of its own process of identification. So rather than sort of engaging in some sort of, nihilistic battle with the object that is only going to result in some sort of very dire consequences for both parties, I would say that the notion of something I call monistic dualism is a better solution of the problem, and that it's not necessarily an essentialism or not necessarily existentialism. It is dual in properties from the standpoint that the subject is a monistic subject, monism is intrinsic to the essentialism of the subject. But in terms of the object, it is entirely existentialistic and posited by the forms of production that exist in society as causes of the activities, perhaps presupposed or rationally chosen by subjectivity, but sometimes when they're irrationally presupposed, the experience of the existential choice will be one of crisis, and that's where the divide between subject and object would occur. So the notion that subject and object can be two distinct, sort of the subjective pole and the objective pole can be entirely distinct, I think is sort of somehow synthesized in this idea of monistic dualism between both poles. So the filling of the lacuna, that space between subjectivity and world, as it were, would not be occupied by anything nefarious. It would rather be occupied by something that was ethically transmitted by the notions that were presupposed by what was already in existence, what was already an existential possibility, and then not necessarily appropriated by the subject, but that they would not be the perpetrators of also just a vague and indifferent essentialism that was pursuing its own self-interests, but was engaging the social forms as such on either pole of consciousness in this notion that I am considering here, that I call monistic dualism. Thank you for watching.